Bueno, pues vamos a continuar.
Okay, I found my place in this study. I lost my place a little bit, but now I found it again. So I will continue with this study, and then we have two more. So again, this was a study an evaluation study of the overall effects of a hospital provided child care program. The hospital provided a child care program for employees and wanted to know what difference this made in the employees' work-related attitudes and behaviors. So of interest was a multidimensional construct that represented attitudes, behaviors, and organizational concepts. We've been through it. It's a three-dimensional construct composed of attitudes, behaviors, and organizational concepts. And they modeled this study after Donald Campbell's observed and expected pattern matching approach. And in this process, one compares an expected pattern to an observed pattern. It's pretty hard to compare patterns because they're complex. In this study, the expected pattern, so what is the expected pattern of relationships among employees' attitudes, behaviors, and various organizational concepts? By collecting some data from the health administrators of various sites. So they were using the administrators to say, this is what should be happening if our child care program is working. Employees should have certain attitudes and behaviors and understandings of certain organizational concepts if the child care program is working. So it's the expected pattern. They generated this expected pattern using a concept mapping process developed by a former colleague of mine, Bill Trocham. It's a very interesting process of possible use in many contexts that I would be happy to elaborate further if anybody's interested. At this point, I'd like to say it's an inductive process where the participants generate concepts relevant to the question at hand, and then sort those concepts, each participant. And then a statistical multidimensional scaling analysis is applied to the sorts to generate a map. Clear enough for now? Okay. So again, this expected map was generated inductively from health administrators. So this is what should be happening. Then they developed an observed map of the empirical patterns of relationships among these constructs, attitudes, behaviors, and organizational constructs. And they did this through a survey. So this is more deductive,
Esto es más deductivo.
taking the constructs but finding out what's happening.
Se estudia lo que está pasando.
And they used statistical intercorrelational analysis, then multidimensional scaling, to generate an observed map.
Un mapa observado.
What they wanted to do was compare the two maps,
Comparar los dos mapas.
which I think is a hard process to do.
Un proceso muy difícil de llevar a cabo.
And so it compared the two patterns of relationships as mapped
Como mapas,
on two-dimensional
como
space.
estaban mapeados en un espacio de dos dimensiones.
And this is an editorial comment.
Y aquí introduzco un comentario editorial.
The idea of using a space, some kind of spatial array, whether it's two-dimensional or more,
Espacial con dos o más dimensiones.
is a very good idea for mixed methods analysis. Because you can put more than one kind of data on a third space. Not all data, but you can do that in some particular ways. So you have all the data in a space and can make various kinds of comparisons and analyses. So instead of just words and numbers, now we have a third analytic frame, a space. There's some interesting mixed method studies that create spaces through geographic information systems, for example, of a neighborhood. And then other data are collected about or from that neighborhood and put on the space. So I'm very excited about thinking spatially about some of the phenomenon that I study and creating spaces for other kinds of data. So I just mention it as I do have one example of it, but this is also an example of arraying data spatially and trying to compare two maps. The other thing about space that I want to editorially mention, I did refer to a book by Miles and Huberman, Qualitative Data Analysis. And spatial arrays is their main message. That if we can array data spatially, we can learn a lot more than we can from qualitative data just treated textually. And the two main spatial ideas they have, we will illustrate. They're displays of some kind, like a map, like a space. It's some kind of visual display, or a matrix. So these examples, these last three, all use some kind of space. Following Miles and Huberman's brilliance, to help us make connections and integrate data. So we have two maps, I'll show them to you, and they were compared both visually and statistically. Again, we're looking at the patterns of relationship in the maps. Do the attitudes and behaviors, are they closer together in one map or farther away? Are the clusters of variables on the maps the same or are they different? So here's the expected map. These various little bullets refer to the attitude, behavior, and organizational construct variables that were measured. So that's the concept map from the health administrators. It's what it should look like. Two-dimensional space. This is the observed map generated from the survey to various nurses and doctors in the hospitals at hand. And what the researchers did, which is hard to portray, is visually make a visual comparison. It's just too long to explain. Are the constructs bunched together in the same way? Are they in the same distance from one another? Or different distances? So they did a bit, well, you can imagine doing that visually and trying to have an account of what seems to be similar and different about these two maps. In what ways is the observed reports of the hospital employees similar and different from how the administrators expected them to be after the child care intervention. So they did that, it's just too long to explain, as many qualitative truths are. And then more simply, they did a statistical analysis. I don't know this statistic, but I like the name. Coefficient of configural similarity, which is a coefficient of 0.76, which is pretty close in terms of similarity. And here's kind of a map of the quite a bit, but the heavier lines mean more consistency among the maps, and the lighter lines mean less consistency. And overall, using this strategy, they found a fairly high degree of correspondence between the administrators' perceptions of the relationships among the concepts related to employer-sponsored childcare, and the correlations of the variables on the survey, which is how the workers in the hospital were perceiving all of this. So again, this is a kind of visual representation of data, a display, and looking for similarities and differences visually and statistically. So there's many other visual displays that could be used, according to Miles and Huberman, but maps of relationships among constructs is one. This next example uses a matrix, which is more common in mixed method studies to think of arraying different data in a matrix, because I think we use matrices more. The first author of this study was a graduate student in our program, Young-Ju Lee from Korea. This is her dissertation study, and she wanted me to be a co-author. Young-Ju is a Korean, South Korean. Like all international students in the US and probably here, Young-Ju had to take the TOEFL, the test of English as a foreign language, and do well enough to be admitted to the university. And that was fine, she didn't mind that. Then she had to take a university test also. She didn't score quite high enough on the TOEFL, so she had to take a university test of English fluency as well. She didn't like that test at all. And her dissertation is in language testing. So, and that was the motivation for it. She did a study of the test she had to take that she didn't think was very good at all. It wasn't testing meaningful. She didn't think it was testing skills that were meaningfully related to graduate study. All dissertations come from somewhere inside our experience. So it was often like language testing studies, there's a predictor and a criterion, predictive validity study.
predicción.
The predictor
El indicador de predicción
was the scores on
eran
this
los valores
ESL English as a secondary language
en,
placement test at the
en
university.
el examen universitario de inglés
She
por
took a
segunda
couple
lengua.
of years worth of data, I think,
Cogió un par de
from
años
this
de datos,
test.
valores en estos tests, notas en
The
estos
criterion,
El criterio era
the predictive criterion, is academic performance
el rendimiento
in the
académico
first semester of
en el primer
graduate school,
semestre de la escuela, de la universidad.
measured 3 ways.
Medido
So
de
here's
tres
what's
formas.
being made multiple.
El rendimiento académico se mide de tres formas.
Grade point average,
La media de expediente,
a range of hypothetically 1 to
que se
4.
organiza dentro de un rango de entre el 1 y el 4.
In reality, it's really only 3 and 4.
Realmente son solo 3 y 4.
Very few graduate
Muy pocos graduados,
instructors of graduate students
muy pocos graduados,
give them bad grades.
muy pocos profesores dan malas notas a los alumnos.
It's the normative expectation
La
in the university.
expectativa normal es sacar entre
If students
4.
can't do well, they are counseled perhaps out of the program.
Si los alumnos no pueden hacerlo bien, se les aconseja que sencillamente abandonen el programa.
I mentioned that because it had a restricted range,
Menciono
and
esto porque había un rango
that
bastante
limits some of the
limitado.
ability of the study to
Y eso
show patterns.
limita un poco la habilidad del estudio para mostrar patrones.
So grade point average, faculty evaluations of student performance in a content course of their major,
En un curso de contenidos dentro de lo que es la línea de estudios principal.
collected both using questionnaires and
Estos datos
interviews.
se recolectan a través de cuestionarios y de entrevistas.
Student self-assessments
También
of their
está
performance in
la
the same course
autovaloración que hace el estudiante de su propio rendimiento en este curso.
using questionnaires and
Para
interviews.
recolectar esa información se utilizan cuestionarios y entrevistas.
Additional information was gathered.
Y después se recoge información adicional.
So she was interested in relationship between performance on that university test
En el test de entrada de idioma
and academic performance the first semester of graduate school in a content course measured multiple ways.
medido de distintas maneras.
So Youngju was absolutely
Así que
thrilled
Youngju estaba totalmente emocionada
that the overall correlation
que la
between
correlación
scores on that placement test and grade point average was about 0.
era de cero.
She said, I knew it.
Sabía que no había correlación.
But she also, in collecting the
A
data,
la hora de
said
recolectar
there's
los
more
datos,
to this story.
dijo que la historia es un poco más compleja, que hay más cosas que mencionar.
So she
Así que
followed mixed methods guidance and tried to put,
siguió el
all of
método
this
mixto y
data
trató
in a
de poner
matrix.
todos estos datos dentro de una matriz.
again, we're having a space
Nuevamente,
for
tenemos
displaying
un espacio donde podemos desplegar los
multiple
datos,
forms of data in the same place
desplegar
and then
datos en un periodo
try
de
to
data
make
múltiple para
interpretations.
intentar hacer interpretaciones de los mismos.
And a big trick in doing a good matrix is figuring out a logical way of ordering the data. Different orderings of data allow you to see patterns and other orderings don't, or you see different patterns. Making a matrix is an iterative process, I think. So in her matrix, I think you can see this better. This is an excerpt from the matrix, and I'm sorry it's very small, but so I'll just explain it. On the far left column are the ESL, the test scores that students received, low, medium, high in order. In the next column is the grade point average, divided into 2, okay, not okay. So she's organizing the data first by placement score test, then by grades. And then the next 2 columns present the faculty and student responses to the interviews about how well these students were doing in these content courses. And those responses are divided into congruent with the test score data and not congruent with the test score data. So even though this is only
Aunque esto es
part of the
solamente
matrix,
parte de la matriz,
if you look at the congruent column,
si miras a la columna de congruencia,
empieza, has trouble listening, second to last in performance,
tiene problemas a la hora de entender,
and you compare it to the next column over,
lo comparas con
assignments well prepared, asked very good questions.
hace buenas preguntas, hace bien los deberes, los encargos académicos.
There's more entries
Hay
in
más
congruent
entradas que no son congruentes.
than in discrepant.
Perdón, hay más entradas en la parte congruente que en la parte discrepante.
Can you see that?
¿Lo podéis ver?
There's just more entries.
Hay más entradas.
Okay, 1, 2, 3. Third column from the left
La tercera columna a partir de
is congruent.
es congruente.
The faculty and student response, and then the fifth column, 3rd and 5, are the congruent,
Son congruentes.
where the interview data is
Donde
supporting
los datos de la
the
entrevista
grade and
están,
test data.
están confirmando los resultados de los exámenes.
And the 4th and
Y
6th
la cuarta y
column
la sexta columna
are where they were not the same, they were
donde no
discrepant,
son-
they said
donde son
different
discrepantes,
things.
donde dicen cosas distintas.
The test score, the grades were low, but the perceptions was, I did really well in this class.
Las
So
notas
this
fueron bajas,
teacher
pero la
said,
percepción de
this
los
was one of the
profesores
best students
o la
in the
percepción de los
class.
alumnos es que el rendimiento fue fabuloso.
And so one pattern you can see already is where are the white spaces in the matrix?
¿Dónde están
Where are
los
there no
espacios
entries?
blancos dentro de la matriz donde no hay entrada? Hay
A
espacios
good matrix will often have white
Una buena
spaces.
matriz va a tener
That's part of the
siempre
story.
espacios no rellenos, eso es parte de la historia.
So her matrix was much bigger,
Su
but still
matriz
had
era
that
más
pattern.
grande, pero tenía ese patrón.
And so what she found from this
Encontró a partir de esto,
was despite overall low correlations
a pesar de las
between
bajas correlaciones
the ESL
entre
test
los
scores
exámenes de idioma
and first semester grade point
y el
average,
expediente medio del primer
there was
semestre,
considerable
había
congruence
considerable
between
congruencia
test data
entre
and course
los datos
performance
y
as judged
el
more
rendimiento
richly
del
by
curso,
the students and the
tal y como
faculty.
estaban juzgados por los estudiantes y los profesores.
So I think matrices have
Yo creo que las matrices
grand potential
tienen un potencial muy grande
for arraying
para
multiple sources of
disponer
data
distintos tipos de
to
datos
look for patterns.
y encontrar patrones.
One of the young Jew pursued this in further analysis and found differences between subject areas. Not surprisingly, English fluency was more important in the humanities, in the social sciences, than it was in engineering or mathematics. That's not surprising, but the data were showing that. And there were some interesting differences in the faculty views of good performance and the student views of good performance. One example I remember, these are graduate students. Most of them didn't care a great deal about their grades. Grades don't count after graduate school. You get letters of recommendation from people. They don't look at your transcript. You have the degree, and you get letters. Yeah. So grades are not very important to many graduate students. Students from other countries do have to maintain a grade point average. But overall, students' motivations for learning and their ways they engaged a particular course had more to do with their own agenda for what they wanted to learn than for achieving a certain grade. So when Youngju pursued this pattern in the matrix, those are the kinds of things that she learned. It's a matrix from another study. So I want to share. Is this mine? Yes, last example. also very creative.
También muy creativo.
And the first author here, Frances Lorenz,
Lorenz
is a very well-regarded
es un,
science educator
es
from the
un
United
educador,
States. She works at the University of
es
Minnesota.
un científico de la educación muy reconocido,
Also a well-regarded science education evaluator.
también un evaluador muy importante y muy reconocido.
So this was a project, an evaluation project
De evaluación
regarding high school science teaching.
con la enseñanza de ciencias en el instituto.
The project involved 3 summers of workshops for teachers and materials the teachers could use in their science classes the following year. It was to help teachers learn something like project-based learning or some kind of cooperative group learning for students. They'd learn that in the summer and then try to apply it the following year. 3 parts to this study. There was a quasi-experimental design focusing on the assessment of student achievement. And there was a mix of methods to assess achievement. A written test, a lab skills test, and a performance test, which I thought was great. The authors adopted a more qualitative social interactionist approach to assess implementation of the program. Evaluators really like to study implementation because if you don't, you have no explanation for what you learned from the results. No idea where those came from. So when the funding permits, it's very important in evaluations to see what's actually happening in the workshops and in the schools. So this was also mixed. Site visits to schools took place with observations of classrooms, interviews with students and teachers, and surveys with students and teachers, getting their feedback on what kinds of pedagogy was being used, how well that was working. And then what they labeled a phenomenological approach, involving multiple, quite in-depth interviews with 6 teachers, seeking a rich portrait of their own experiences in this program. So this is a mix at all levels, method, methodology, and framework. They did the usual analyses. Lots of different methods, looking for relationships and patterns and so forth. But then they wanted to put it all together. They wanted to somehow connect the various data sets, data sources, what they had learned about them. They wanted an integrated picture. So they adopted a metaphor, that of an archipelago. So they created different islands representing different sets of data, student test scores, faculty perceptions of the quality of the in-service, use of various kinds of pedagogies in the classroom. They didn't have an island for every single data source, but they had a bunch of islands representing data sources and findings. 3 clusters, sorry. So they had 9 islands. No, 10, whatever. Yeah, whatever that adds up to, sorry. And they wanted to arrange them in an archipelago. part of an archipelago, as I understand it, is some of the islands are connected underneath the sea, and some are not. You know? It could be two archipelagos or three, or it could be one lone island all by itself, and the rest are connected. So I think that was the kind of work they were trying to do, building on correlational relationships among the different data sources that they had, observations they had made, understandings that they generated from their analyses. And so I'm imagining this process involved analyzing the characteristics of islands for similarities and differences, changing the topography of islands that came closer together to have more similarities, imagining fish life and plant life and shorelines of different islands, moving the islands around so that the imagined contours of the islands and their closeness or distance to one another fit with the data that they had. And again, is there one underlying land mass on the archipelago, 2, 3, 10? And then I imagine an artist coming in and having fun actually drawing this. So this was I think this archipelago metaphor and the actual implementation of it was probably not funded by our National Science Foundation. They did it as an experiment and actually generated some insights about the interrelationships among these complex things that they had not generated before. So I love the idea of a metaphor, another space, in this case three-dimensional, not just a matrix, three-dimensional, and trying to make an archipelago that fit the data and then say, what do we have here? So very quickly, we're just reviewing mixed methods inquiries, the intentional, connected use of more than one tradition, methodology and method, and or method, in service of better understanding. Integrated mixed methods analysis are most relevant for integrated designs. I have not seen this, but I think it's possible that these kinds of integrated analysis, perhaps this archipelago kind of idea, or a matrix, may also provide some insights into the linking task in component designs. In component designs, we analyze all the data separately, and we make connections during the inferencing process. I think that's a non-trivial task. I think it's a hard task. So maybe some of these display ideas could help us do that. I'd love to see an example. This notion of taking on these integrative analysis with the spirit of adventure and creativity helps us do it, I think. And being open to dissonance as well as consonance, I think, is also important. And may I credit all of the authors of these studies for creativity and imagination. This is a very inductive field. There's no theory of integrated analysis. We're coming up with this from the ground up. Here's the framework again that we went through examples of each of the analysis strategies on the right. And here's the examples connecting the study back to these analysis strategies. The machismo study, where they transform data in order to analyze it together. The school adoption in Toronto, innovative, I'm sorry, this was the other study, large-scale study where they were missing a lot of data. So they generated a coding system, one level up, recoded all of the data, and were able to get some results from that. The preschool inclusion study, where that qualitative, quantitative, transform, move over to the other side and then compare. Graph, I think getting data in the same form allows us to make comparisons more easily. The Toronto school success study of schools serving immigrant children involved 3 different strategies: data transformation, data importation, let's take the structure of meaning from the interviews and rescale the survey, and the extreme case analysis. Once we reanalyzed the data, we took a school high in parent involvement and one low in parent involvement on these rescaled survey scores to see what we could learn. Mary Lee Smith's Arizona State Testing Program, where she put all the data in a big room and iteratively generated piles, complex piles that generated complex assertions. The pattern matching study, that's not the right study, it was the hospital study, where they generated an expected pattern of relationships among attitude, behavior, and organizational concepts by using an interviewing inductive procedure with administrators, and then an expected pattern administering a survey to hospital employees, and had some ways of comparing those two. Young Julie's matrix, which we just looked at, and Frances and her colleagues' archipelago display. Ahora es el tiempo para los comentarios y cuestiones de ustedes.
Me han pedido la palabra antes de entrar en la sala el profesor Benito Varias. Creo que quería hablar algo de la inferencia.
A ver, que se la ha llamado.
¿Alguien tiene el micro?
Así mientras te lo vas pensando.
No, pero no. Esto es solamente para mí. Gracias a los tres.
Sí. Bueno, muchas gracias. Yo no quería hablar de la inferencia precisamente, porque me da la impresión de que la inferencia es un concepto no epistemológico, sino filosófico, y aún diría más ontológico, cuyas raíces me temo que se remontan al poema ontológico de Parménides, pasando por Aristóteles, Platón y hasta Heidegger, sin olvidar a Berkeley y a Kant. O sea, plantear ahora un problema como este me da la impresión de que nos llevaría bastante más tiempo del que disponemos. De todos modos, estoy abierto a un poquito más adelante hablar de ello. Lo que sí quería comentar es que después de oír a la profesora Greene, a mi juicio, las fuentes principales en las que se basa la integración entre los métodos cuantitativos y cualitativos residen en tres fuentes. En primer lugar, el enfoque general de la investigación, que a mi juicio es ideográfico en el caso de los enfoques cualitativos y nomotético en el caso de los cuantitativos. Es decir, los cuantitativos necesitan una enorme cantidad de datos para llegar a soluciones estables mediante análisis multivariados. En tanto que los cualitativos utilizan muestras mucho más pequeñas y, como digo, enfoques ideográficos. Este es el principal problema que yo veo. El segundo problema está en el foco principal de la investigación, que a mi entender, en el caso de los enfoques cualitativos, está en la riqueza de los datos. Por ejemplo, los enfoques etnográficos o los fenomenológicos o los narrativos se fijan fundamentalmente en la riqueza y en la densidad de los datos, en tanto que los enfoques cuantitativos se fijan sobre todo o tienen como principal problema el problema de la precisión en la medida. Como decía Felipe González Castro en el artículo que ha citado usted de 2010, la precisión en la medida es el principal problema de la metodología cuantitativa. Lamentablemente, en las ciencias sociales no sabemos medir. Y no sabemos medir gracias a que un ilustre compatriota suyo, el doctor Stevens, definió medida de una forma harto peregrina. Por ejemplo, él decía que medir es asignar números a objetos de acuerdo con reglas conocidas, lo cual no tiene nada que ver con la medida. Otro compatriota suyo, que se llama Campbell, sí dio un concepto de medida mucho más interesante, pero es que Campbell era físico, no era un científico social. Y la tercera cuestión sería algo en lo que usted ha hecho mucho énfasis, es el respeto. Y me parece que todavía no nos respetamos suficientemente, quizás porque el respeto nace del conocimiento y la falta de respeto nace de la ignorancia. Si cada uno de los que preconizamos los distintos métodos conociéramos más de los otros, probablemente nos respetaríamos mucho más y enfocaríamos los temas desde ese planteamiento dialógico que usted ha preconizado. Finalmente, me ha interesado mucho el uso del escalamiento multidimensional como método propio del acercamiento de métodos mixtos. Yo he hecho algo sobre el escalamiento multidimensional, he publicado algún artículo sobre eso y nunca se me había ocurrido, la verdad, que se pudiera utilizar como metodología dentro del acercamiento mixto, del cual me alegro mucho. Lo que pasa es que el escalamiento multidimensional es un método descriptivo, no es inferencial. O sea, a partir de los resultados del escalamiento multidimensional no podemos obtener inferencias, como decía el profesor Rubia antes, acerca de la naturaleza de los datos. Únicamente podemos describirlos y compararlos de una forma subjetiva. Los datos que usted nos ha proporcionado sobre el escalamiento multidimensional no nos han ofrecido una información fundamental, que es el nivel de ajuste, es decir, el grado de estrés que tienen esos datos. Por lo demás, me ha interesado mucho. Gracias.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Very kind. I am not enough of an expert in multidimensional scaling to realize what I did not present, but I appreciate that I did not do full justice to that. But may I just applaud your three points to make, or your three dimensions, the ideographic and the homometic, the idea of wealth of data, almost too much, and thin data, thick and thin, or fat and skinny, getting a lot and trying to get it right, the accuracy you mentioned. That is to me exactly the rationale for mixing methods, that any given method does something well but misses a lot. So more than one method can get more of it. May I thank you especially for your third point about respect. I think that is essential. And unfortunately, many of my colleagues, perhaps like some of yours, don't approach their work that way. It's more of a contest to see who's better than a joint effort to actually generate more useful, meaningful results. So thank you very much, I appreciate it. Other possible questions to pursue, if anybody would like.
Esta será muy breve. Usted ha hablado varias veces esta tarde acerca del concepto de multidimensionalidad, que es un concepto que a mí me interesa mucho. Yo distinguiría, y quisiera saber su parecer al respecto, entre multidimensionalidad sustantiva y multidimensionalidad métrica. ¿Está oyendo?
Ahora tengo, gracias.
Ahora sí.
Sí.
Repito la pregunta. Repito. Decía que usted esta tarde ha hablado varias veces acerca del concepto de multidimensionalidad. Es un tema que a mí me preocupa, me interesa mucho, y yo distinguiría entre multidimensionalidad